okay? If I'm going to pay a bunch of people to come in and risk their lives, they're going to expect much higher compensation than if I ask them to come in and simply keep other people from being violent and participate in ensuring that a dispute is safely arbitrated. You know, these organizations themselves have reasons not to be violent. Here are some obvious ones. Number one, they like to be trusted by people. If it's determined that instead of following just rules in determining how to resolve a dispute, I instead use violence, nobody's going to trust me. I've already mentioned expense. If I try to resolve a dispute violently, that's far more costly much of the time. And obviously there also just is the matter of social norms. There's no reason to suppose that people who operate protective agencies are on the whole going to be unresponsive to the expectations of people around them, that they behave in appropriate ways. It's even possible, I don't want to dwell on this possibility unnecessarily, it's even possible that some of them might be personally principled. It's not just that they're responding to the expectations of others and internalizing social expectations about their behavior as people operating protective agencies. No, they might actually be principled people who would prefer to see fair outcomes. Obviously, you can't run an entire society on the assumption that everybody's a good person, but you can perfectly well recognize the possibility that moral constraints, internally embraced moral constraints, will be among the factors responsible for good behavior, along with trust and cost. Now, the Tannehills note that when you resolve disputes in a stateless society, you're going to save money as compared to the dispute resolution processes available in the court system in our society. Why is that? Because guess what? The courts in our society are monopolies. Now, there are other dispute resolution mechanisms available. We understand that. You can go to private arbitration. You can ask your pastor or your brother-in-law to mediate a dispute for you. But if you want to operate within the confines of the court system, you're dealing with a system that arrogates certain powers to itself and claims the right to control when force is used, and it delivers its services at a high cost that nobody gets to reduce through competition. A monopoly court system can charge what it wants to. Now, I firmly think the Tannehills are right about this, that if you envision a set of arbitration agencies operating in a highly competitive market, it's going to be the case that those arbitration agencies will have good reason to behave well, to be professional, to employ rules that everybody thinks are credible, to do a good job. But I think the Tannehills are mistaken by focusing only on professional arbiters. And I think this is a blind spot on their part. They mock local juries as ignorant and incompetent. And, you know, I think it's surely right that professional arbiters could and would resolve some disputes in some communities in a stateless society. I don't doubt that for a second. But I also think it's fair to say that local institutions, what Kevin Carson, following Larry Gambone, has called mutualized institutions, would do so as well. Okay? So the idea that Carson talks about, following Gambone again, is that we imagine the existing institutions of the state at the local level, things like schools and water boards and sanitation districts and so forth, not simply as dissolving when the state at the macro level dissolves, but as being mutualized. That is, as being taken over by local people and operated on a voluntary basis. So not monopolistically, not excluding competitors, but taking advantage certainly of the fact that the infrastructure these institutions need to operate is already in place and continuing to operate them. And surely that would be true of local juries in local court systems. Would there also be alternate arbitration systems that people would regard as legitimate? Of course. But local juries representing the consciences of their communities represent something very important morally, I think. They allow members of local communities not to pretend expertise in highly technical areas of science or law, but nonetheless to express the convictions of community members about the basic moral issues in dispute in trials. The Tannehills exhibit, I think, a kind of surprising elitism here in supposing that ordinary jury members might not be able to understand the complex issues raised in the kinds of trials that the Tannehills are envisioning here. I don't think that's right at all. And I think that a credible local arbitration entity, one that really enjoyed the support of people in a community in which it operated, would very often be one that employed local juries. Another way to put this is to say that arbitration agencies ought not to be thought of as operated just by professionals. Volunteers would surely staff some agencies. That's not the same by any means as contemporary jury service. And of course, what's the key difference? Contemporary jury service is slavery. It's forcible. You will be subject to penalties by the state if you don't participate as a juror. You're underpaid and you are forced to work for the state whether you want to or not. That's bad news. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the willingness to perform a service for others, operating out of a sense of fairness, out of concern for the well-being of one's community. I think that's quite different from jury service performed as it is at present at gunpoint. Now, another quibble with the Tannehills. I think there's all sorts of good stuff here about how certain kinds of market-based dispute resolution systems would operate. I do just want to note, however, that I think the Tannehills are at least inconsistent with one of the really great anarchists in the American individualist anarchist tradition, Lysander Spooner, in envisioning that debt service could be a responsibility that obtained for the entirety of somebody's life. So I'm unable to pay a debt. That means that my wages will be garnished in perpetuity and so forth. Maybe that's right, but it's worth noting that Spooner plausibly argued that it made more sense to see a creditor as reasonably claiming such assets as the debtor had at the time a debt fell due. But, Spooner said, the creditor would have no future claim on the debtor's labor or assets. Part of making arrangements for a debt in the first place would be estimating the debtor's reliability, and because, as in the title transfer theory that Rothbard articulates, because title to subsequent goods and certainly the labor of the debtor didn't pass to the creditor when the debt was contracted, the debtor finally is only liable for what she has at the time the debt falls due, on Spooner's view. I think we could argue back and forth about that, and undoubtedly there would be different contractual arrangements that different debtors and creditors would reach. But I think it's worth noting that if there were a widespread social norm at any rate, suggesting that only the resources available to a creditor at the time the debt fell due would be available for claim by the creditor, clearly this would reshape the way in which debtor-creditor relationships were structured in the first place. The contracts would be different, interest rates would be different, qualification for borrowing would certainly be different. In any event, I think Rothbard is wrong, and anybody else is also wrong, who says that we are going to envision in a stateless society a single law code that everybody's going to endorse. And so undoubtedly there would be some communities that might be inclined to follow the Tannehills and some that might be inclined to follow Spooner. It's just important to recognize that from a moral standpoint, it's not obvious that the Tannehills are right here. So the Tannehills move, at any rate, from talking about the mediation of disputes to the mechanisms that might actually be used to protect life and property. Now, to repeat, they say all sorts of useful things here, not because the things they say represent the only ways in which somebody might protect life and property in a stateless society, but because they talk about useful mechanisms, and we certainly encourage you to check out what they have to say. But it is regrettable that, once again, they begin by bashing pacifists. Not sure what their beef with pacifists is exactly.